Chapter 1. The Demolitionist. The dust in a hive city never truly settles. It hangs in the air like a suspended sentence, tasting of recycled sweat, pulverized ferrocrete, and the metallic tang of ancient industry. You learn to breathe it before you learn to walk. I remember the taste of Sector 7 on the day I died. It wasn't a death of the body, not yet, but it was the end of the person I thought I was. I was standing on a gantry 300 meters above the sludge rivers of the Undersump, looking at a habitation block that had been condemned by the Administratum. They didn't tell us why. They never do. Maybe it was structural rot, maybe a minor outbreak of something viral, or maybe someone in a high spire just wanted a better view. It didn't matter. The order was signed, the stamp was wet, and I was the man with the detonator. I checked the charges for the 5th time. Standard pattern melta charges placed at the structural knees of the building. Most demolitionists are butchers. They use too much explosive, creating a mess of shrapnel and noise that scatters debris over half the district. They think destruction is about power. They are wrong. Destruction is about precision. It is about understanding that even the mightiest tower is just a collection of stresses and tensions, desperately trying to fight gravity. You don't need to punch the building, you just need to trip it. I ran my gloved hand over the cold casing of the primary charge. It hummed slightly, a machine spirit sleeping, waiting for permission to wake up and eat the world. I felt a kinship with it. We were both waiting for the signal to do the only thing we were good at. The foreman was shouting something over the Vox bead in my ear, complaining about the timeline. He was a small man, bloated on cheap starch rations and self-importance. I tuned him out. The wind was picking up, howling through the rusted canyons of the hive, carrying the screams of a million souls living in squalor. I closed my eyes and listened to the building. It groaned. Deep within its bones, the rebar was rusting. The concrete was flaking. It was tired. I was doing it a favor. That's what I told myself. There was a mercy in a clean end. I wasn't killing a home. I was euthanizing a beast that had been sick for 10,000 years. Detonation sequence initiated, I whispered. Not to the foreman, but to the building. A courtesy. My thumb hovered over the rune on the remote. It wasn't a button, it was a precipice. The moment before the fall is always the sweetest. It's the only time you have total control. In a galaxy of wars and gods and monsters, that split second of silence is the only thing that truly belongs to you. I pressed it. There was no thunderclap, not at first. If you hear the explosion instantly, you've done it wrong. First, there was a sharp crack, like a giant snapping a dry twig. The charges fired in a cascading rhythm, a sequence I had calculated to the millisecond. The supports vaporized. The building didn't explode outward. It sighed inward. It slumped, surrendering to the pull of the planet. Floors pancaked onto floors, expelling plumes of gray dust that looked like ghosts fleeing a grave. It was beautiful. It was a perfect vertical collapse contained within its own footprint. No debris hit the neighboring hab blocks. No shrapnel flew wild. It was a mathematical equation resolved in stone and fire. For a moment, I just watched the dust cloud rise, swallowing the ruin. The vibration traveled up through the soles of my boots, a heavy thrum that resonated in my chest. It felt like applause. I expected the usual chatter from the crew, the cheers of the workers, who would now get paid and spend their credits on Amasek to forget where they lived. But the Vox was silent. Not just static, but dead air. I tapped the bead. Nothing. I looked around the gantry. The foreman was gone. The security servitors, usually standing like lobotomized sentinels at the lift, were gone. The gantry was empty save for the swirling dust and the dying light of the pollution-choked sun. A coldness that had nothing to do with the wind settled in my gut. I wasn't alone. I knew it with the instinct of a prey animal that realizes the tall grass is moving against the wind. I turned slowly, my hand drifting toward the heavy wrench on my belt, a useless gesture, but a human one. Standing in the shadows of a support pillar was a figure. He didn't look like an enforcer. He didn't look like a ganger or a gilder. He wore a gray body glove that seemed to absorb the dim light, making him look like a cutout in reality. No insignia. No face, just a smooth, featureless mask of matte plasteel. "Excellent geometry," the figure said. The voice was synthesized, stripped of accent or gender, sounding like it came from the walls themselves. The collapse was within 0.2% of the theoretical model. You compensated for the wind shear on the 4th tier. It wasn't a question. It was an autopsy of my work. "Who are you?" I asked. My voice sounded thin, swallowed by the roar of the hive. "This is a sanctioned demolition zone. You're trespassing." The words felt hollow as soon as they left my mouth. Laws and sanctions mean nothing to things that move like he did. He stepped forward, and I didn't hear his boots touch the metal grate. Silence is heavy. We think of noise as weight, but silence is the true burden. It presses on your eardrums, demanding to be filled. "You waste your gift on dead stone," the figure said. He was closer now. I hadn't seen him move. One blink, and he had crossed 10 meters. You understand the fracture points. You see the weakness in things. That is a rare perspective in an Imperium obsessed with building walls. He tilted his head, the blank mask reflecting the settling dust cloud behind me. "We have a wall that needs to fall. A wall much larger than this." I pulled the wrench free. It was a heavy slab of iron used for unjamming blast doors. I swung it with all the fear and adrenaline pumping through my veins. It was a good swing. It would have cracked a skull. But the figure wasn't there anymore. He was inside my guard. His hand, armored in a material that felt like cold ceramic, clamped onto my wrist. He didn't squeeze. He just stopped me. It was absolute. It was like hitting the planet itself. The wrench clattered to the floor, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet. "Observation complete," the voice said. "Subject meets the criteria for the architecture of ruin." I tried to kick, to scream, to do anything, but a second figure had materialized behind me. I felt a sharp pinch at the base of my neck. Not a blow, just a precise insertion. Cold fire flooded my nervous system. My knees turned to water. The world didn't go black, it went gray. The colors drained out of the hive. The rust, the grime, the distant neon signs, they all faded into a monochrome blur. I fell, but I never hit the ground. Arms caught me. Strong, impersonal arms. They held me not with care, but with the efficiency of a cargo loader securing a crate. As my senses failed, the last thing I saw was the ruin I had created. The dust was settling on the rubble, covering the twisted metal and shattered concrete in a soft gray blanket. It looked peaceful. It looked ordered. I had taken a chaotic, rotting structure and turned it into a perfect pile of silence. I realized then that I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid that I would never get to do it again. The obsession was already there, rooted in my marrow. The need to see things fall. Structure is a lie, I thought, or maybe I said it aloud. The words tasted of iron and blood. Gravity is the only truth. Then the darkness took me, not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a closing door. The sound of the city, the constant roar of humanity was cut off. There was only the smell of antiseptic and ozone, and the sensation of moving very fast, very deep into the belly of a beast I didn't know existed. I was no longer a demolitionist. I was raw material. And the manufacturing process had just begun. Chapter 2. The Silent Halls. I woke up to the smell of ozone and old blood. It wasn't the copper tang of fresh violence, but the stale chemical scent of a place where bleeding is a scheduled activity. The floor was cold against my cheek. Not the concrete cold of the hive which holds the memory of the day's heat, but a sterile, absolute zero that sucked the warmth right out of the bone. I opened my eyes. There was no light, only a gray bioluminescent moss clinging to the ceiling, casting just enough illumination to see that I was in a box. 3 meters by 3 meters. Plasteel walls. No door that I could see. No vent. Just me and the hum of a ventilation system that sounded like a dying lung. I sat up. My clothes were gone. The heavy work leathers, the tool belt, the boots all stripped away. I was wearing a single garment of rough gray synth weave. It scratched my skin, a constant reminder that comfort was a luxury I could no longer afford. I touched my face. The stubble was gone. My head was shaved. They had taken everything that made me distinct, everything that said, Kaylin. I was a blank slate. I stood up and touched the wall. It was seamless. There were no rivets, no welding scars. It was perfect construction. And because it was perfect, I hated it. I wanted to find the seam. I wanted to find the crack. A voice crackled from nowhere. It didn't come from a speaker. It vibrated through the floor plates. Assemble. That was the only command. A panel in the wall slid open with a hiss of pneumatic pressure. A metal tray slid out. On it lay a pile of components. Springs, gears, localized power cells, optic lenses. I recognized the parts, but not the whole. They were delicate machined to tolerances that the factories of my home world had forgotten millennia ago. I reached for them. Then the light died. Total darkness, the kind of black that has weight. It filled my mouth and my lungs. I froze. Panic, that old animal instinct, tried to claw its way up my throat. I wanted to scream, to pound on the walls, but I remembered the man in the gray suit. I remembered the silence of the falling building. Screaming was a waste of oxygen. Panic was a structural weakness. I forced my breathing to slow. In, out. In, out. I knelt on the freezing floor and reached into the dark. My fingers brushed the cold metal of the components. Without sight, my sense of touch amplified. I could feel the microscopic ridges on a screw. I could feel the temperature difference between the brass gear and the steel casing. I picked them up one by one, creating a map in my mind. This piece fits here. This spring provides tension there. It was a puzzle, but a puzzle with consequences. I could hear breathing from the other cells. I wasn't alone in this block. To my left, someone was weeping softly, a jagged, broken sound. Then a sharp hiss, a muffled thud, and the weeping stopped. The silence returned heavier than before. I worked faster. My hands moved of their own accord, guided by a lifetime of fixing broken things in the dark underbelly of the city. I realized what I was building. It wasn't a weapon. It was a lock mechanism for a high-grade gene vault. Why make us build locks? I slotted the tumbler into place. It clicked, a tiny sound, but in that sensory void it was like a gunshot. I felt the mechanism align. It was smooth, frictionless. It was perfect. Done, I whispered. The light slammed back on, blindingly white. I shielded my eyes, gasping. The tray retracted into the wall. A moment later, a slot opened at the base of the wall, and a nutrient bar fell out. It looked like gray clay and smelled like algae. I ate it. Not because I was hungry, but because my body was a machine, and machines need fuel. I looked at my hands. They were trembling just slightly. Not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the dark. I had passed. I didn't know what the grade was, but I was still breathing. Days blurred into nights. There was no cycle here, only the lights and the tasks. Sometimes we assembled. Sometimes we disassembled. Always in the dark. Always with complex, unfamiliar tech. I learned the internal geography of a cogitator bank by the heat of its circuits. I learned the tension of a tripwire by the vibration in the air. I realized the lesson. They weren't teaching us to be engineers. Engineers need light and schematics. They were teaching us to be viruses. A virus doesn't need to see the host to kill it. It just needs to know the shape of the cells. I stopped thinking about escape. Escape implies there is somewhere to go. There was only the hall. I stopped thinking about my name. Names are labels for things that matter. Here, we were just potential energy waiting to be directed. I began to find a strange comfort in the routine. The fear receded, replaced by a cold, hard focus. I was becoming sharper. I was becoming hollow. One cycle, the voice returned. "Silence is not empty," it said. "It is waiting." The wall of my cell slid open. It didn't lead to freedom. It led to a long metal corridor lined with identical cells. Other figures in gray tunics stepped out. We looked at each other, hollow eyes and gaunt faces. No one spoke. We didn't need to. We all knew the truth. The ones who had wept in the dark were gone. We were the ones who had worked in the quiet. We were the survivors of the silence. We walked forward, a procession of ghosts, moving deeper into the machine that had eaten us. I looked at the back of the recruit in front of me. I saw the way his spine moved beneath the thin fabric. I found myself calculating where I would strike to sever the cord. It wasn't malice, it was just assessment. I looked at the corridor walls. I saw the pressure conduits running behind the panels. I knew where to cut to vent the atmosphere. I was no longer seeing the world as a place to live. I was seeing it as a series of targets. The screening was over. The education had begun. Chapter 3. The Fulcrum. The classroom was not a place of learning. It was a place of dissection. We didn't sit at desks. We stood around tables made of brushed steel, the surfaces scarred by acids and lasers. The air was dry, recycled so many times, it tasted like dust and copper. Our instructor was a man named Magos Varric, though he looked less like a priest of Mars, and more like a ruin that had learned to walk. Half his face was replaced by a sensor array that clicked softly as he scanned us. He didn't teach us how to build. He taught us how things die. He spoke of entropy not as a force of nature, but as a tool to be wielded. A barbarian swings a hammer. Varric rasped his voice, sounding like grinding stones. He strikes the wall until his arm tires, or the wall breaks. This is waste. This is failure. He paced around the room, trailing a metal pointer that scratched against the floor. You are not barbarians. You are surgeons. You do not break the wall. You make the wall want to fall. He stopped in front of a holographic display of a bridge. With a single tap, he highlighted a rusted bolt no bigger than a finger. The fulcrum, he whispered. The single point where all the tension meets. Remove it, and gravity does your work for you. I listened, and for the first time since the kidnapping, I felt a spark of something other than fear. I felt hunger. Back in the hive, I had used explosives to force buildings down. I had wrestled them into submission. But Varric was talking about something else. He was talking about persuasion. He was talking about murder without a weapon. The idea seduced me. It was cleaner. It was superior. The test came on the 30th cycle. Varric led me to a workstation. On it sat a working-scale model of a plasma generator. It was fully functional humming, with a dangerous contained energy. It was the heart of a city miniaturized. "Kill it," Varric said. "You have 5 minutes. If you trigger the containment alarms, you fail. If you use external force, you fail." He stepped back, his optic clicking. I looked at the machine. My old instinct screamed at me to sever the power coupling. That would kill it instantly. But it would also trigger the alarms. It was too loud. I looked closer. I watched the flow of the coolant pumping through transparent tubes like blue blood. The pump was rhythmic, a steady heartbeat. Thump, hiss, thump, hiss. I saw the pressure valve. It was designed to vent excess heat. If I broke it, the machine would melt down, but that was still force. I reached out not for the valve, but for the intake filter. It was a small mesh screen designed to catch particulate matter. I didn't remove it. I took a small piece of synth cloth from my pocket, a scrap I had saved, and placed it over half of the intake. I didn't stop the flow, I just restricted it. The machine didn't notice. The sensors read the flow as within acceptable tolerance just at the lower end, but the heat began to rise. Slowly, imperceptibly. I stepped back and folded my hands. "Done," I said. Varric looked at the machine. It was still running. It was still humming. "It lives," he said accusingly. "Wait," I replied. I watched the temperature gauge. It crept up degree by degree. The coolant pump began to work harder to compensate. The vibration increased. A low whine started a sound of distress. The machine was eating itself, struggling to breathe through the restricted airway. It wasn't an attack. It was a stroke. 2 minutes later, the primary coil fused. There was no explosion, no alarm until it was too late. The machine simply shuddered, gave a wet, metallic cough, and died. The hum vanished, replaced by the ticking of cooling metal. It was a silent death, a natural death, or so it would seem to anyone investigating. Varric looked at the dead generator, then at me. His human eye narrowed while his bionic eye whirred in focus. "You choked it," he said. There was no praise in his voice, only cold recognition. "You turned its own need for survival against it." He nodded once. Efficient. I looked at the dead machine. I felt a cold thrill in my chest, colder than the liquid nitrogen in the pipes. I had killed it without violence. I had killed it with a piece of cloth. I realized then the power of the fulcrum. I didn't need to be strong. I didn't need to be an army. I just needed to know where the system breathed and put my thumb over the windpipe. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever learned, and I loved it. Chapter 4. The culling. The simulation dome was vast, a cavernous hollow beneath the earth, where the weather was dictated by a machine spirit with a cruel sense of humor. It was raining. Not the cleansing rain of an agri-world, but a heavy, acidic drizzle that hissed when it hit the mock ferrocrete pavement. The water tasted of sulfur and recycled sorrow. We were dropped into the ruins of a fake city, a labyrinth of plywood and sheet metal painted to look like a war zone. The objective was simple survival. But in the Sabatorum, survival is a zero-sum game. For one to rise, another must fall. My target was Jaren. He wasn't just a recruit. He was the only person in the facility who had looked me in the eye without assessing my kill value. We had shared silence in the mess hall. He had a habit of humming a low, tuneless melody while he field-stripped his cutter. It was a human noise, a small rebellion against the quiet. I hated it because it reminded me that we were still men. Now, I had to kill him. Not because I wanted to, but because the curriculum demanded it. If I didn't, we would both be recycled. I knew Jaren. I knew he was stronger than me. In a straight fight, he would break my neck before I could lift a hand. But Jaren had a flaw. He still believed in camaraderie. He thought that because we suffered together, we were allies. He didn't understand that shared pain doesn't create a bond. It creates a competition to see who breaks first. I didn't hunt him. I didn't stalk him through the ruins. I simply found a building with a compromised support beam, a deliberate weakness left by the instructors, and I waited. I sat in the open, huddled against a piece of rubble, looking small and defeated. I let my weapon lie on the ground just out of reach. It was the perfect bait. A wounded animal, a structural failure in the unit cohesion. I waited for hours, letting the cold rain soak through my fatigues, turning my skin numb. When Jaren finally appeared, moving like a shadow through the mist. He didn't shoot. He paused. He saw me shivering, weaponless, staring at nothing. "Kalen," he whispered. It was barely a breath, but it carried across the wet street. I didn't move. I let him make the choice. He could have walked away. He could have ended me right there. But the hesitation came. The human part of him, the part that hummed melodies, took over. He stepped forward, lowering his guard, stepping into the kill zone I had mapped out in the mud. He was coming to help. He was coming to check on me. He stepped onto the loose flagstone that concealed the pressure trigger. The trap was simple. A tension cable snapped, releasing a ton of loose masonry from the overhang above. It wasn't an explosion. It was just gravity answering a call. The sound was wet and heavy, a sudden crump of stone on flesh. Jaren didn't even scream. One moment he was there, a silhouette of concern. The next, he was buried under a pile of gray ruin. I stood up. The shivering stopped. I walked over to the pile. A hand protruded from the rubble, twitching slightly before going still. The fingers were curled, as if trying to grasp something that wasn't there. I looked at the debris. It was a mess, but it was effective. I had used his compassion as a fulcrum. I had leveraged his humanity to crush him. The rain continued to fall, washing the red streaks into the gray mud. I felt a hollowness in my chest, a void where my conscience used to be. But underneath that, there was something else. A cold, hard clarity. Trust is a structural weakness. It is a crack in the armor that allows the knife to enter. Jaren had failed because he was a person. I had succeeded because I was becoming something else. "Target neutralized," I said to the empty air. The simulation lights flickered and died, plunging the world into darkness. The door to the exit ramp hissed open, bathing the wet street in harsh yellow light. I stepped over the hand without looking back. I didn't hum. I didn't feel sick. I just felt light, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The weight of being human. I was empty now, and empty things are very hard to break. Chapter 5. Deployment. The Loyal World. The wind here smelled of yeast and sunlight. It was a sickeningly wholesome scent. I stood on the viewing deck of Sector 4's primary grain silo, looking out over an ocean of golden wheat that stretched to the horizon. This was Ager Prime, a world that existed solely to feed the hungry maw of the sector capital. There was no war here, no craters, just the endless rhythmic swaying of crops, and the distant lazy hum of harvesting combines the size of cathedrals. It was peaceful, and I was here to murder it. I adjusted the collar of my uniform. I was no longer Kalen the Demolitionist. I was Magos Audit Kalen, a low-level functionary of the Departmenta Munitorum sent to inspect the efficiency of the storage protocols. It was a boring cover, and therefore a perfect one. No one looks twice at a bureaucrat with a data slate. They just want him to leave. The local foreman, a man with sun-weathered skin and hands rough as bark, was practically tripping over himself to show me the quality of the grain. "Top-grade Magos," he said, beaming. "Enough here to feed a hive block for a year. The Emperor provides." He touched the Aquila pendant on his chest. He was loyal. He was hard-working. He was innocent. I looked at him, and I felt nothing but a dull metallic ache in my chest. I wasn't here to inspect the grain. I was here to ensure it never reached the ships. "Show me the environmental control exchangers," I said. My voice was flat bored. "The humidity regulation needs to be verified." We descended into the bowels of the silo. The air grew cooler, heavy with the dust of millions of tons of grain. The noise of the outside world faded, replaced by the deep industrial thrum of the circulation fans. These machines were ancient, reliable, and stupid. They did exactly what they were told. They kept the grain dry. If they stopped, rot would set in within days. A fungal bloom would consume the harvest from the inside out, turning food into poison. I ran my hand along the intake manifold. It was vibrating smoothly. Efficiency is high, I noted, tapping a meaningless code into my slate. The foreman nodded vigorously. We take pride in our maintenance, sir. We know our duty. He didn't know that his duty was about to become his grave. The orders from the Sabatorum had been specific. Denial of resources, induce localized famine, trigger unrest. They didn't say why. They never said why. I looked at the massive spinning blades of the fan. It would be so easy to just toss a wrench in. But that was amateur work. That was vandalism. A broken fan gets fixed. A saboteur's work is permanent. I needed the system to fail in a way that looked like natural decay, a failure of the spirit of the machine, not an act of malice. I needed the rot to be a surprise. Leave me, I told the foreman. I need to perform the sanctification rites on the machine spirit. Alone. He hesitated, then bowed and retreated up the gantry. I watched him go. He was whistling. A happy man. A dead man walking. I opened my kit. I didn't take out a bomb. I took out a small vial of corrosive gel and a set of calibration tools. I wasn't going to break the fan. I was going to change its mind. I was going to tell the sensors that wet air was dry and hot air was cold. I was going to make the machine lie to its masters. Efficiency is not always the goal, I whispered to the spinning blades. The sound was swallowed by the roar of the air. Sometimes suffering is. I applied the gel to the sensor contacts. It dissolved the gold plating just enough to skew the resistance. The data stream flickered on the console. Humidity read, 10% perfectly dry. In reality, I was opening the vents to the swamp-humid air of the cooling towers. I watched the readout stabilize. The lie was now the truth. The machine accepted it. The rot would start tonight. Slowly at first, a microscopic invasion of mold spores, warm and wet in the dark. By the time they smelled it, the entire silo would be black sludge. I packed my tools. I felt like a doctor injecting a patient with cancer. I walked back up the stairs into the golden sunlight. The foreman was waiting. All is well, Magos, he asked. The machine spirit is content, I lied. The harvest is secure. I walked away, the sun warm on my back. I didn't look at the wheat. I couldn't. All I could see was the rot spreading beneath the surface, a shadow growing in the heart of the gold. I was a monster in a paradise, and the worst part was, I was good at it. Chapter 6, The Art of Accident. The water filtration plant was less a facility and more a digestive system for the city. It was a labyrinth of dripping pipes, thrumming pumps, and reservoirs of black water being churned into something drinkable. The noise was a physical weight, a constant rhythmic pounding that vibrated in the teeth. It smelled of chlorine-wet stone and the deep, earthy rot of river silt. I stood on a maintenance walkway looking down at the primary drive shaft. It was a colossal column of steel, rotating with the slow, unstoppable force of a planet turning. It drove the pumps that kept 10 million people alive, and I was going to give it a terminal disease. I wasn't here to destroy the shaft. If the shaft snapped, they would replace it. The Imperium is good at replacing things. It has warehouses full of spare parts and spare men. No, I needed to destroy something harder to replace faith. I needed the people to believe that their leaders were incompetent. I needed them to believe that the machine spirit had been neglected. A bomb is an act of war. A breakdown is an act of betrayal by those in charge. I opened a small canister. Inside was a gray paste, gritty and unremarkable. Industrial diamond dust, mixed with a corrosive bonding agent. It wasn't high-tech. It was ancient, simple, and cruel. I didn't pour it into the oil reservoir. That would be too obvious. Instead, I climbed down the ladder to the exposed gear teeth of the secondary coupling. The gears were the size of men meshing together with a slick, oily kiss every 2 seconds. I waited for the rhythm. Clank hiss. Clank hiss. Make it look like incompetence, I muttered, timing my breathing with the machine. Hate breeds faster than fear. I applied the paste to the leading edge of a single gear tooth, just a smear. The next time it meshed, the paste would spread to the mating gear. It would embed itself in the metal. It wouldn't break the tooth immediately. It would act like sandpaper, microscopic and relentless. Every rotation would shave off a fraction of a micron of steel. The heat would rise. The friction would build. The oil would burn off, turning into a black sludge that clogged the lines instead of lubricating them. I watched as the gear turned, carrying my poison into the heart of the mechanism. The sound changed. It was subtle, audible only to someone who listens to structures for a living. The smooth hum developed a throatiness, a low grinding rasp. It sounded like teeth gnashing in the dark. It sounded like frustration. I wiped my gloves on a rag and tossed it into the sump below. There was no evidence. When the forensic tech priests examined the wreckage in 3 days, they wouldn't find explosives. They would find wear patterns consistent with skipped maintenance cycles. They would find negligence. The governor would blame the workers. The workers would blame the governor. And while they screamed at each other, the water would stop flowing. I climbed back up the walkway, the sound of the grinding metal following me. It was an ugly sound, discordant and wrong, but to me, it felt like a composition. I was conducting a symphony of friction. I realized then that I had stopped caring about the thirst that would follow. I was only interested in the mechanism of the failure. I was an artist of accidents, and this was my masterpiece. The water flows, I said, looking at the dark, churning liquid one last time, until the gears say no. I left the plant through the service entrance, stepping out into the cool evening air. The city lights were flickering on in the distance, ignorant of the heart attack I had just induced in its chest. I felt a strange sense of power. Not the loud power of a bolter, but the quiet, terrifying power of a loose screw. I was the entropy in the system. I was the reason things fall apart. And I walked away, leaving the metal to scream alone in the dark. Chapter 7. The Fall. The city didn't die all at once. It spasmed. I was watching from the balcony of a high-spire hotel, a glass of water in my hand, one of the last clean glasses on the planet, though the guests inside didn't know it yet. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the hive. At first, it was just a sound, a low, rising wail that harmonized with the wind. The civil defense sirens. They started in the industrial district, where the water pumps had finally ground themselves into jagged scrap, and they spread outward like a contagion. I took a sip of water. It was cool, clear. Down below, 1 million people were turning their taps and finding nothing but a brown, oily sludge. I could imagine the confusion first, then the panic. Thirst is a primal fear. It bypasses logic. It turns the neighbors into competitors. I watched the lights of the traffic gridlock freeze. The arteries of the city were clogging. The heart was seizing. It was a magnificent, terrible mechanics of sociology. I hadn't touched a single person yet. I was holding the throat of the entire population. Then came the smell. Even at this altitude, the wind carried it. A sickly, sweet stench of fermentation. The grain silos. The rot I had planted in the dark had bloomed. The pressure of the expanding gases inside the storage units had finally blown the relief valves. The golden harvest was now a black, toxic slurry pouring out into the streets. I watched through a magnocular scope. I saw tiny figures swarming the base of the silos, desperate for food, only to recoil from the poisoning reek. They weren't starving yet. The hunger wouldn't set in for days. But the fear of starvation is more violent than the hunger itself. The hollow screens on the neighboring towers flickered from advertisements to emergency broadcasts. The governor's face appeared wide-eyed and sweating, pleading for calm. He spoke of technical difficulties and temporary rationing. But the people knew. The mob always knows when the leash snaps. I saw the first fires bloom in the lower districts. They weren't strategic fires. They were fires of rage. They were burning the administrative centers, the ration distribution hubs. They were attacking the symbols of the order that had failed them. Beautiful, I whispered, though the word tasted like ash. It wasn't the beauty of creation. It was the beauty of the equation balancing itself. I had removed the inputs, water and food, and the output was chaos. It was inevitable. It was physics. I felt a surge of vertigo, a sudden, terrifying realization of scale. A bolter kills a man. A bomb kills a platoon. But a broken gear kills a civilization. I looked at my hands. They looked the same as they always had. No blood, no gunpowder residue, just the faint lingering smell of industrial lubricant. The riots grew louder, a roar that rivaled the sirens. I saw enforcer barricades being overrun. I saw the flash of last fire, tiny pinpricks of light in the deepening gloom. The governor was blaming the workers. The workers were blaming the nobles. The nobles were blaming the governor. The snake was eating its own tail just as I had planned. I had turned their loyalty into suspicion, their unity into a knife fight for survival. I set the glass down on the railing. I didn't drink the rest. It felt wrong to consume what I had denied to so many. I wasn't just a killer anymore. I was a god of small things. I controlled the variables that made life possible. The realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel distant, as if I were watching a colony of ants from behind a glass wall. I had separated myself from the human race by the simple act of understanding how fragile it was. I didn't light the fire, I said to the burning city below my voice, lost in the rising cacophony of the riots. I just dried the wood. The night fully descended, illuminated not by streetlights, but by the orange glow of anarchy. The screams drifted up faint and ghost-like. I turned my back on the view. There was nothing more to do here. The gravity of the situation had taken over. The fall was self-sustaining. I packed my kit, checked the room for any trace of my presence, and walked out the door. The elevator ride down was smooth, silent, and civilized, a perfect counterpoint to the hell waiting in the lobby. I was leaving the ruin, but the silence I carried inside me was growing louder. Chapter 8. The Hidden Hand. The safe house was buried 3 kilometers beneath the burning city, a pocket of sterile air in a world choking on smoke. I sat at a metal table, a glass of amasec in front of me. The liquid was amber thick and smelled of peat and iodine. It was a luxury, a reward for a job well done. Above me, millions were screaming, fighting over the last drops of water, tearing each other apart in the dark. Here, the air recyclers hummed a lullaby of perfect filtration. I watched the liquid in the glass tremble slightly. It wasn't my hand shaking. It was the tectonic vibration of the riots, the collective footfalls of a population in panic. It was the only connection I had left to the surface. My handler sat opposite me. He was a man of indeterminate age, his skin the pallid, waxy texture of someone who hasn't seen a sun in decades. He wore the robes of the administratum, but the way he sat, still coiled, dangerous, betrayed his true allegiance. He didn't drink. He just watched me. There was no congratulation in his eyes, no shared camaraderie of soldiers. Just the cold calculation of a mechanic inspecting a tool that had just performed a stressful task. The mortality rate in Sector 4 is approaching 12%, he said, reading from a data slate. His voice was dry, like shifting sand. Civil unrest has reached critical mass. The governor has declared martial law, but his enforcers are overwhelmed. The planetary defense grid is offline due to lack of power. He looked up. The operation is a total success. I took a drink. The amasec burned going down a clean chemical fire. Why, I asked. It was the first time I had asked that question aloud since my recruitment. They were loyal. They were productive. Why break a machine that works? I wasn't asking out of pity. I was asking out of professional curiosity. The sabotage had been too thorough, too damaging for a simple political maneuver. We hadn't just changed the regime. We had salted the earth. The handler placed the slate on the table. He leaned forward, and the shadows in the room seemed to deepen. Because loyalty is slow, he said. The Imperium is vast, Kalen. Bureaucracy takes months. Mobilization takes weeks. We don't have weeks. He tapped a rune on the slate, and a holographic map projected into the air between us. It showed the sector, and at the edge a purple stain. A shadow. Tyranids, I whispered. The word felt heavy in my mouth. The Great Devourer. A splinter fleet, the handler corrected. Small, but fast. It will be here in 3 days. If we tried to evacuate this world through standard protocols, the paperwork alone would take a year. People would argue. They would try to save their possessions, their heirlooms, their petty dignities. He gestured to the ceiling, to the chaos above. But now they are hungry. They are thirsty. They are terrified. When the evacuation ships arrive at dawn, they won't ask questions. They won't pack bags. They will trample each other to get on board. They will leave this world willingly because we have made it a hell they want to escape. I stared at the map. The logic was monolithic. It was a brutal, unassailable calculus. We hadn't destroyed the world to kill them. We had tortured them to save them. Or perhaps we were just denying the enemy a healthy meal. A starving population is less biomass than a well-fed one. I realized then the true nature of the Officio Sabatorum. We weren't just destroyers. We were the shepherds of fear. We used terror as a goad to drive the herd where it needed to go. And those who don't make it to the ships, I asked. Biomass denial. The handler said, his face expressionless. Scorched earth. Better they die by our riots than feed the hive mind. He stood up, signaling the end of the debriefing. He walked to the door, then paused. You feel guilty. That is a chemical reaction. Ignore it. You saved millions of souls from digestion today. You are a hero of the Imperium. Remember that. I was left alone with the hum of the recyclers and the trembling glass. I looked at the amber liquid. I thought of the families burning above the children crying for water, the sheer terror that was saving them from an even worse fate. It made sense. It was rational. And it was the most monstrous thing I had ever heard. I finished the drink in one swallow. The bitterness lingered on my tongue, masking the taste of ash. I accepted the lie because I had to. Because if I didn't, I was just a murderer. Hope is slow, I said to the empty room, repeating his words like a catechism. Fear is fast. We need fast. I poured another glass. The bottle was almost empty. Outside, the world continued to burn, and I sat in the cool, quiet dark, waiting for the next order to destroy something beautiful for the greater good. The silence in the room wasn't peaceful anymore. It was complicit. Chapter 9. The new target. The ship was a cathedral of gold and hypocrisy, drifting through the void. It was called the Gilded Saint, a rogue trader vessel with a warrant of trade, ancient enough to be signed in blood. The corridors were lined with velvet, the air scrubbers scented with lilac to mask the stench of the cargo. But I wasn't there for the gold. I was there for the cargo. The lower decks were packed tight with refugees from Aegir Prime, the world I had broken. They were the lucky ones, the ones who had trampled their neighbors to get to the shuttles before the Tyranid shadow fell. They thought they had escaped hell. They didn't know that hell had followed them on board. I moved through the service crawlways, a ghost in the ship's arteries. My uniform was different now. Maintenance crew grease-stained and invisible to the eyes of the nobles, celebrating on the bridge. The mission was absolute. The rogue trader was suspected of harboring gene stealers among the refugees, hoping to sell them as slave labor in the fringe sectors. The Imperium could not risk the contagion spreading, but they couldn't just destroy a rogue trader without political fallout. It had to look like an accident, a catastrophic failure of the warp drive during transit. I paused at a ventilation grate looking down into the cargo hold. The sight stopped me cold. Thousands of people were huddled in the dark, sleeping in shifts on the metal grating. I saw faces I recognized, not individuals, but the type. The exhausted mothers, the men with hands calloused from the grain silos I had rotted. They were the debris of my previous success. I had saved them from the jaws of the alien, only to deliver them into the maw of the warp. A bitter bile rose in my throat. I swallowed it down. I was a tool. Tools don't feel pity. Tools don't judge the hand that wields them. Then I heard it, a sound that cut through the low thrum of the engine. A child crying. It wasn't a scream of pain, but the low, rhythmic sobbing of exhaustion. It echoed through the metal ducts, amplified by the acoustics of the ship. It sounded like the ship itself was weeping. I gripped the rungs of the ladder until my knuckles turned white. In the silence of the ducts, that cry was a judgment. It was a reminder that biomass denial and political containment were just sterile words for murder. I forced myself to keep moving. I descended toward the engineering deck, the crying fading behind me, but ringing in my ears. The air grew hotter, charged with the static electricity of the warp drive. The Geller field generator hummed nearby, a bubble of reality pushing back the ocean of madness outside. If I disabled the drive while the field was fluctuating, the ship wouldn't just explode. It would be unmade. The diamonds would pour in. It was a death worse than the Tyranids. It was a death of the soul. I reached the access hatch to the primary drive chamber. My hands were steady, but my mind was vibrating. I was about to kill 10,000 survivors. I was about to finish the job I started on the ground. I whispered the mantra of the Sabatorum, trying to drown out the memory of the child's voice. Loose ends must be cauterized. The words felt like gravel. I wasn't cauterizing a wound. I was burning the patient alive. I keyed the code. The hatch hissed open. I stepped into the blinding purple light of the engine room, leaving the weeping ghosts behind me in the dark. The cycle was closing. I was just the gravity that would pull the guillotine down. Chapter 10, the Saboteur sabotaged. The heart of the ship did not beat. It spasmed. The warp drive was a colossus of brass and containment fields, suspended in the center of a spherical chamber that defied standard geometry. The air here tasted of ozone and copper, charged with the static of a dimension that wanted to dissolve us all. The light was the worst part. It wasn't natural. It was a bruised, sickly purple that cast no shadows, only voids. It seeped through the heavy blast shutters of the viewing ports, whispering of things that had teeth and patience. I moved toward the primary control console, my boots magnetic locked to the deck plates, to fight the erratic gravity shifts. I reached the terminal. My hands were ready to input the cascade sequence, a command that would lower the Geller field for exactly 3 seconds during transit. Long enough to let the sharks in, short enough to look like a fluctuation. But my fingers froze before they touched the rune keys. The dust on the console was disturbed. A panel had been pried loose, then carefully replaced. The screw heads were misaligned by a fraction of a millimeter. To a layman, it was invisible. To me, it was a neon sign screaming intrusion. I wasn't the first one here. I didn't turn around. I knew the doctrine. If you turn, You present a target profile. I watched the reflection in the polished brass of a pressure gauge. A figure stepped out from behind the coolant stacks. They wore the same grease-stained maintenance fatigues as me, but the way they moved was unmistakable. It was the Predator's gait. Silent, balanced, efficient. It was another Saboteur. "You're late, Kalen," a voice said. It was female, but stripped of inflection, flattened into a professional monotone. I recognized her. Unit 73. We had assembled rifles together in the dark. The mission profile didn't include a partner, I said, still watching the reflection. I slowly unclipped the hydrospanner from my belt. It wasn't a weapon, but it was heavy, solid steel. "I'm not your partner," she replied, stepping closer. "I'm your contingency." She stopped 3 meters away, just outside striking range. She held a suppressed auto pistol leveled at my spine. "The handler flagged your psych profile. Hesitation detected during deployment. Empathy spikes. You're compromised, Kalen. You're starting to think about the meat instead of the machine." I turned, slowly keeping my hands visible. The purple light washed over her face, making her look like a corpse. "So they sent you to watch me. They sent me to ensure the timeline," she said, "and to liquidate the redundancy. You are the redundancy." The betrayal didn't sting. It made perfect sense. In a system built on breaking trust, why would we trust each other? Paranoia was the fuel of the Officio Sabatorum. If I was the knife at the throat of the Imperium, she was the knife at mine. We were a nesting doll of murderers. "You tampered with the console," I said, nodding to the panel. "You set the overload already. But you did it wrong. You bypassed the safety shunt, but you didn't ground the feedback loop. It won't just drop the field. It will detonate the core. You'll kill the ship instantly. No mystery. No accident." "It's cleaner," she argued, her eyes flicking to the console for a microsecond. "Certainty is preferable to subtlety." "That's why you're just a contingency," I said. "You don't understand the art." I kicked the emergency vent release at my feet. It wasn't a combat move, it was a distraction. A jet of superheated steam blasted from the floor grate between us. It was a wall of white noise and scalding heat. She fired blindly. 2 rounds pinged off the brass pipe next to my head. I didn't retreat. I lunged through the steam. Pain is just information. The burn on my skin told me I was alive. I tackled her. We hit the deck hard, the auto pistol skittering away into the purple gloom. She was faster than me. She drove a knee into my ribs, cracking bone. I gasped, tasting blood, but I didn't let go. I jammed the handle of the hydrospanner into the joint of her elbow, using leverage to snap the arm. She didn't scream. She hissed a sharp intake of breath and headbutted me. Lights exploded behind my eyes. We rolled across the deck, a tangle of limbs and intent. We weren't fighting for ideology. We were fighting for the right to be the one who killed the ship. It was absurd. It was the ultimate joke of our existence. We watched the Watchers. I grunted, getting my forearm across her throat. I pressed down. I felt the cartilage shift. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the warp light. There was no fear in them, only anger that she had miscalculated the vector of my attack. She clawed at my face, her nails digging furrows in my skin, trying to find my eyes. "Structure." She gagged her face, turning purple, matching the room. "Fails. Everything fails," I whispered. I shifted my weight and drove the heavy steel spanner down onto her temple. There was a wet, sickening crunch. Her struggle stopped instantly. The tension left her body, leaving only dead weight. I rolled off her, panting my chest, heaving with broken ribs. I looked at her. Unit 73, a perfect machine dismantled by a slightly more desperate machine. I stood up, swaying. The steam was clearing. The warp drive pulsed a rhythmic thumping that sounded like laughter. I was alone again. But the lesson was carved into me now. There is no brotherhood in the dark. There is only the mission and the people who haven't died yet. I looked at the console. She was right about one thing. The timeline was advancing, and I had a ship to kill. Chapter 11. The chain reaction. The ship was screaming. It wasn't a metaphor anymore. The structural groans of the hull had harmonized with the sirens to create a voice of pure mechanical terror. I stood over the body of Unit 73, wiping her blood from my face. The console she had rigged was flashing a terminal countdown. Red runes chased each other across the screen, counting down to a core breach. She had been clumsy. She had set the drive to detonate to turn the Gilded Saint into a miniature supernova. It would be quick, it would be merciful, and it would kill me. I looked at the numbers. 20 seconds. I could vent the core abort the reaction and save the ship. The passengers would live. The rogue traitor would reach his destination. And I would be branded a traitor by the Officio, hunted down, and peeled apart slowly in a black cell. Or I could let it burn and die a loyal martyr. Neither option appealed to me. I am a survivor. That is the only religion I have left. I looked at the warp drive. It was pulsing violently, the brass containment rings spinning so fast they blurred into a golden sphere. The light from the viewport was no longer purple. It was a kaleidoscope of colors that the human eye isn't designed to see. It hurt to look at. It felt like needles in the optic nerve. The whispers were getting louder, leaking through the seals. They knew the door was about to open. They were hungry. There is a third path, I muttered, my fingers flying across the keypad. I didn't stop the overload. I redirected it. Instead of dumping the energy into the core, I shunted it into the navigation array. I burned out the translation drives. I fused the Geller field generator into a locked degrading loop. The ship wouldn't explode. It wouldn't return to real space. It would be stranded here in the tides of the Imperium, drifting forever. The field would hold for a week, maybe a month. Just long enough for the food to run out. Just long enough for the madness to set in. The ship lurched. Gravity failed, then slammed back with crushing force. The red countdown froze, then vanished, replaced by a single blinking amber rune. Navigational error, translation impossible. The engine's roar changed pitch. It settled into a low, sick, grinding sound. The sound of a beast caught in a trap, gnawing on its own leg. I stepped back. The deed was done. I hadn't killed them. I had just removed the exit. The 10,000 souls on board were now residents of hell. They would live to regret survival. I looked at the corpse of Unit 73 one last time. She wanted certainty. I gave her eternity. Death is too clean for us, I whispered to her unseeing eyes. The whispers from the walls turned into laughter. Low, wet laughter that seemed to come from the inside of my own skull. I turned and ran. Not walked. The dignity of the Saboteur was gone. I scrambled toward the escape pods, the only part of the ship I had ensured would still function. The corridors were tilting, the geometry of the ship twisting as the warp pressed against the hull. I saw shadows moving in the corners of my vision, things that were too tall and had too many limbs. They weren't here yet, but they were watching, waiting for the field to flicker. I reached the pod bay. It was empty. The crew was too busy fighting the fires to think about abandoning ship. I sealed the hatch of the single-occupant pod. The silence returned thick and heavy. I punched the launch sequence. The clamps released. There was a jolt, a sudden sensation of falling, and then the star-filled void of, no, not stars. Through the porthole, I saw the ship receding. It looked small against the backdrop of the warp, a golden toy floating in an ocean of storms. It was already beginning to twist, the spires bending like wax. I watched it until the mists swallowed it whole. I was adrift, a tiny speck of metal in the belly of the beast, waiting for the retrieval beacon to sing its song. I had survived. But as I looked at the swirling madness outside, I wondered if I had really left the ship, or if I had just brought the nightmare with me. Chapter 12. The Ghost in the Machine. I am back in the White Room. It might be the same room I started in, or an identical one on the other side of the galaxy. It doesn't matter. The architecture of the Officio Sabatorum is universal. It is built of silence and stainless steel. I am sitting at a desk, the surface perfectly smooth, typing my after-action report. My hands are clean. The blood of Unit 73 has been scrubbed away by chemical showers. The radiation of the warp has been purged from my cells. I look the same as I did when I was a demolitionist in the hive, perhaps a little thinner, a little paler. But the thing inside the skin has changed. It has hardened. I type the lie. Target vessel. The Gilded Saint suffered catastrophic drive containment failure, resulting in total vaporization. No survivors. Threat neutralized. I pause. The cursor blinks a rhythmic pulse of green light. It is a lie. The ship is not vaporized. It is drifting in the Imperium, a ghost ship full of screaming souls. But the Administratum does not deal in ambiguity. They want a closed file. So I give them one. I press Submit. The file vanishes into the data crypts of Terra, becoming truth, because it is written down. I feel no guilt. Guilt is a friction that slows down the machine. I have oiled the gears. The door slides open. The handler enters. He looks exactly like the last one, though I know he is different. He places a new data slate on the desk. He doesn't ask about Unit 73. He doesn't ask about the ship. He points to the slate. Your efficiency rating has been adjusted, he says. You are no longer a jagged tool. You are a precision instrument. The High Lords have a use for such clarity. He turns to leave his robes, whispering against the floor. Rest. The transport leaves in 6 hours. I pick up the slate. The screen flickers to life, displaying the next assignment. I expect another rebellious hive city, or perhaps a forge world that has held back its tithe. But the coordinates are different. Segmentum Solar. Sector 0-1, the throne world itself. Terra. The text is brief assessment of structural vulnerabilities in the outer pilgrim districts. They are bringing me home, not to save it, but to find out how it breaks. I walk to the small mirror in the corner of the cell. I look at my reflection. I try to find Kalen, the man who liked the sound of falling dust. He isn't there. There is only the saboteur. I listen to the silence of the room. It isn't empty anymore. It is filled with the ticking of a clock that only I can hear. It is the countdown of the universe. Everything is waiting to fall. The walls, the cities, the stars. They are just waiting for the right man to find the fulcrum. I trace the line of my jaw. I imagine the vast golden spires of Terra, the palace, the Eternity Gate, the greatest fortifications ever built by human hands. Most men would weep at the sight of such glory. I will not weep. I will study the mortar. I will check the foundations. I will look for the cracks that no one else wants to see. And one day, when the order comes, I will be the one to push the button. I sat back on the cot. The silence was absolute. I kept cleaning the invisible dust from my fingernails. There was nothing else to do. The work would continue. It always did.